Could you put that envelope in front of the...
Good morning. I don't have PowerPoint. I'm doing analog.
Yeah.
My talk is called Psychic Spaces and Racialized Embodiment, Exploring the Pleasures and Pain of the Vegan Exotic. This presentation is about whiteness, racialized embodied experience, and how exotic is experienced within certain psychic and physical spaces as pleasurable for some, while painful for others. I will be using the ethical and health consumption movement of veganism to explore how race, whiteness, and the exotic operate. This is a larger part of my dissertation work that looks at how race and whiteness are produced and reproduced in particular vegan spaces and places in North America. For those of you unfamiliar with the term vegan or veganism, these philosophies characterize people who do not believe in consuming animal products in their diet and non-dietary practices. Most popular representations of veganism in the USA are depicted through PeTA campaigns, and the most current literary spaces that represent veganism can be seen in New York Times Bestselling titles Kind Diet, Veganist, as seen on Oprah, and Skinny Bitch. If you apply a critical race feminist analysis to these titles, you will quickly see that the authors, all white, class-privileged, able-bodied women, born and raised in the USA, write their vegan knowledge from a place that ignores issues of class and race and how this affects food access. Also absent is how health and nutrition are more cultural than natural common sense. A fundamental question that I have for my own research is, what is it about racial class experience in the US that leads some proponents of veganism to take a race-neutral approach to this alternative food philosophy, while for others, the issue of race and class is not separate? To quickly explain some terms, what do I mean by race-neutral, raceless, or post-racial? Well, these terms denote people who believe that racism or white supremacy no longer exists because skin color no longer has social significance. These concepts for me fall under the realm of whiteness or white privilege. Using dialogues from the online blog Vegans of Color, I will focus on the uses of the word exotic, as well as how the embodied experience of being non-white in white-dominated spaces is connected to emotional distress and discomfort for a significant number of vegans of color. In 2007, Joanna, a vegan of color, established an online forum called Vegans of Color. In resistance against mainstream notions of veganism as being separate from whiteness and race, the founder of the group stated, quote, "Many vegan spaces seem to be assumed, consciously or not, to be white by default, with dialogue within often coming from a place of white privilege. We're not single issue here. All oppressions are connected," end quote. And on August 15, 2008, Joanna wrote, quote, "I'm really uncomfortable with how a lot of vegan cooking is described as exotic. To whom? It assumes so much about the audience racially and culturally, and as well as loaded with really creepy connotations. The exotic is there to be conquered, mastered. It's there purely to titillate your white Western self," end quote. Joanna rejects the objects of the exotic as an emotionally pleasurable experience. Simultaneously, it is implied in her post that collectively, white westernized embodied experiences towards objects of the exotic are experienced as emotionally pleasurable. How does Joanna, as well as other vegans of color on the forum, know that the exotic is morally problematic? Simultaneously, how does the collective white Western-bodied exotic adventurer know that it is not a moral problem? In 2008, Joanna posted threads about exoticism and veganism for vegans of color for vegans of color who experience objectification of their bodies, their own cultures, and non-white bodied homelands, largely by white enthusiasts from the global West. Vegan of Color S shares her critique of the word exotic on this thread. Begin quote, "The only vegan environments I operate within are online. My big annoyance is that I get to see my food, the food I grew up with, labeled as exotic, and I get that exotic means different, but it's usually a white vegan blogger writing for a white vegan audience, and so my food is being called different. I wrote about it a bit longer in my blog once, and it's really frustrating," end quote. Cram, a white-identified woman participating on this thread, replies to S and attempts to explain her point of view on exotifying foods and labeling foods as foreign. She writes, quote, "My curiosity is this. Is the labeling and importance of every word or term hurting the cause of veganism? If I were ever to be called out on terms of white guilt or being colonialist, or other terms for trying to go to events that are more inclusive of people of color, or run by or sponsored by people of color, then I would be not inclined to participate in these events," end quote. It is quite telling telling that Cram reveals that she does not want to participate in any event run by people of color if she is made to feel white guilt or called a colonialist. Her response above conveys that it may never have occurred to her that perhaps she is engaging in colonialist-type behavior when it comes to her relationship with exotically labeled foods. However, she maneuvers away from the possibility of deeply reflecting on why being, quote, called out on terms of white guilt, end quote, makes her disinclined to participate in people of color-sponsored events. White-identified vegans, Gary and Megan, from the discussion, reveal their unfamiliarity with the negative connotation to the word exotic as well. Gary writes, quote, "Thanks for bringing this up. I was looking back over my recent writings, and I think sometimes I was a bit careless in my use of the word exotic. I will watch out for that in the future. What would be acceptable uses of exotic," end quote. And Megan writes, "I never really thought about the use of the word exotic or ethnic in that way, i.e. my white middle-class American way. Thanks for opening my eyes a bit," end quote. Gary, Megan, and Cram's relationship to the word exotic parallel Lisa Helke's book, Exotic Appetites. Helke, a white-identified middle-class university professor, examines a type of unacknowledged cultural food colonialism amongst her particular demographic. She writes, quote, "The name I chose was cultural food colonialism because, as I have come to see, my adventure eating was and continues to be strongly motivated by an attitude with deep connections to Western colonialism," end quote. This is not to say that all white-identified people and vegans of color have similarly naive relationships to exotic, or even whiteness and white privilege, as Gary and Megan and Cram. However, what is striking is that there wasn't one person of color on the two threads about exotic who was unaware of this or who had a positive relationship with the word exotic. Carolina, a vegan of color, writes about her negative relationship to the concept of exotic in response to Cram. She gives a hypothetical situation, quote, "At a vegan event, there is a wide array of food. You spot a dish you've never tried before, but you are all for trying it. You pick up something out of your plate. You sit down and chow down on it. You liked it and you state out loud, 'Did you try that one potato-like thing? I'm not sure what it is all about, but it was very exotic.' 'Oh yeah, I love it when people bring foreign food,' says her neighbor. The vegan of color who brought the dish is sitting at the same table and perhaps says something or does not, but they are offended. It is demeaning and offensive to the culture, where the food comes from, and the person who made it. Once again, look at its history and its use," end quote. Carolina's hypothetical situation reveals that more than just food tasting is occurring at the vegan event. It is one thing to directly tell someone at a vegan event that they are exotic and foreign. It is another thing to feel comfortable enough to bypass that person and label their food as exotic and foreign, and never give it a second thought that the social placement of one's food is the placement of that person. Referring to a non-white person's food as exotic while at a predominantly white-bodied event conveys that this non-white vegan does not belong here. The lack of critical reflection from white vegans about this topic is an example of how white privilege and whiteness as the norm are invisible to them. Whiteness studies scholar Sarah Hoagland writes, quote, "That most whites walk through our day ignorant of our interdependency with peoples of color is not about invisibility of whiteness, but rather about the erasure of peoples of color as subjects," end quote. Race studies scholar Sarah Ahmed writes that such a reoccurring process, quote, "makes the body itself the site of social stress for many non-whites," end quote. And it is this racialized stress that those people of color and vegans of color experience as emotional pain, a unique type of non-white racialized emotional pain and stress that are simply not part of embodied experiences of whiteness that the white collectivity of vegans experience. Hence, that white people generally do not know this pain at the visceral level becomes an epistemological challenge when people of color convey their ills with the exotic, ills with being a non-white person in white-dominated vegan spaces, or simply being a non-white person in a society in which whiteness continues to be the invisible norm. As their bodies enter white vegan spaces, their non-whiteness is immediately visible and is constantly in the forefront of the gaze of white participants. Nassim, a vegan and a woman of color living in Canada, writes, quote, "Not too long ago, I attended the first and only AR, animal rights, veggie workshop I've been to in my community. My ex-partner and I were two of only 4 people of color there, of at least 60 to 70 people. Not to mention we knew the 2 others. How funny is that? As soon as I walked in, I felt uncomfortable. I remember specifically signing in and having issues with a woman because she just can't seem to hear me when I told her my name numerous times. All of this crap was really getting to me, but I think what really bothered me most was the overwhelming assumption of privilege in the room. I mean, the issues discussed were things such as how to get vegan options at your favorite restaurant. I had never before this day been exposed to this other side of veganism. I suppose you could call it, dare I say, the trendy vegans, the white vegans that are vegan because veganism is becoming a social status symbol. I was so frustrated with the population, the cause, and felt that I could not call myself a vegan anymore, as if vegan were a white word, end quote. Nassim's experience of feeling invisible as a Middle Eastern woman with a Muslim-associated name while navigating through white spaces resonates with the experience of many racialized minorities who live in white settler nations. Her feelings of not belonging are everyday realities, even fears of mine, that was in quotes, occur too frequently within the psychic spaces of racialized minorities navigating through seemingly post-racial white spaces. Her psychic experience of her place at this vegan workshop is deeply connected to the politics of mobility. Dr. Sarah Ahmed, a scholar of racialized embodiment within white spaces, writes of similar experiences, begin quote. The politics of mobility, who gets to move with ease across the line that divides spaces, can be re-described as the politics of who gets to be at home, who gets to inhabit spaces as spaces that are inhabitable for some bodies and not others, insofar as they extend the surfaces of some bodies and not others. Those who get stopped are moved in a different way. I have suggested that my name slows me down, a Muslim name, for the body recognized as could be Muslim, which translates into could be terrorist. The experience begins with discomfort. Spaces we occupy do not extend the surfaces of our body, end quote. I'm not suggesting that white participants at the workshop that Nassim attended saw her as a terrorist. However, what I'm suggesting is that one of the reasons Nassim feels invisible comes from having to repeat her non-white and non-Anglo name within a space of radical food politics in which vegan praxis manifests from a collective white privilege experience. While Nassim must constantly deal with the emotional stress of moving throughout white Canadian spaces as a racialized minority and vegan, the white participants, in terms of their racial politics and racialized mobility, worry only about moving through Canadian spaces as vegan. Nassim's interpretation of this group's vegan praxis as being rooted in epistemology of whiteness is quite telling. It implies that getting a vegan item on the menu of one's favorite restaurant is a privileged concern. Can I comfortably enter this restaurant as a non-white vegan with a non-white sounding name within a political climate that marks non-white people as foreign would not most likely be part of the workshop that Nassim attended. In reading Nassim's experience, to be a white racially privileged vegan in Canada means to produce spaces of vegan politics and praxis that unconsciously mimic the taken for granted mobility of whiteness and white privilege. Not only do many other racialized minority vegans not have a sense of belonging or connectedness in predominantly white vegan spaces, this feeling is experienced beyond the realm of veganism or food spaces in general. To understand where the quoted vegans of color are coming from, one must understand the context of the spaces of taken for granted whiteness that they navigate through. For example, when white people living in white-dominant nations go into regular, read white, mainstream grocery stores or pharmacies, they remain the humanized subject, finding items for themselves that are covertly marked as normal, not being labeled as normal at all. It is simply a given that it is for normal bodies, read white. Products in a white normative aisles in which the products are catered toward white bodily experiences. These items are not relegated to the ethnic or exotic aisles of hair products and food. Suave and Pantene shampoos, Clairol hair coloring, and thinly spaced black combs are for the normal, read white body. Signs for these aisles will simply read hair care products. Cream of Nature, La Car cholesterol conditioner, and Afro Picks are for the other, the exotic, the non-white body. Signs for these aisles will be marked as ethnic hair care products. The purpose of bringing these examples into the analysis of the dialogue about people of color feeling discomfort at predominantly white vegan and animal rights events is to point out how these little things, such as ethnic versus normal shampoo, or exotic vegan products versus normal vegan products, etc., are not little things at all. Most importantly, these examples provided show a structural context in which many white-identified vegans are operating. Often at a very unconscious level, many are simply mimicking what they see throughout regular stores, regular restaurants, regular colleges, and those regulars are all quotes. They are not necessarily coming up with the idea that non-white foods are exotic, but they are reproducing these covert ideas of normative whiteness within a space that is supposed to take its food and politics seriously. Sarah Ahmed writes, quote, "Collectively, white bodies do not get stressed in their encounters with objects or others as their whiteness goes unnoticed. Whiteness would be what lags behind. White bodies do not have to face their whiteness. Spaces are oriented around whiteness insofar as whiteness is not seen. The effect of this around whiteness is the institutionalization of a certain likeness, which makes non-white bodies feel uncomfortable, exposed, visible, different when they take up these spaces." So lastly, I'm hoping that the examples from the Vegans of Color blog will help move post-racial white vegan activists closer to breaking down barriers and engage in a critical reflexivity around racially privilege-oriented ways of being and knowing the world within food justice movements within white-dominated or white-settled nations. The entire 35-page chapter that this presentation is from can be found in the upcoming new edited volume by Alison Alcott and Julian Agamon called Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, MIT Press. Thank you.